The bell above Rosie's diner gave a soft jingle as the door swung open, letting in a gust of October wind and a swirl of damp leaves. Inside, warmth returned quickly, booths upholstered in red vinyl formica counters polished to a nostalgic shine, and the scent of fresh apple pie mixing with black coffee. The jukebox hummed gently in the background, playing something slow from another era. At the corner booth, as always, on a Tuesday afternoon, Franklin Hayes sat alone. 92 years old and dressed in a simple gray sweater and slacks, he wore his Marine Corps cap with the same pride he once wore his uniform. His back was straight, his eyes clear, but his hands trembled slightly as he lifted his mug of coffee. The tremor was worse in cold weather, a legacy of frostbite and shrapnel buried deep since Korea. Few noticed him, fewer still knew his name. That was about to change. The front door slammed again, and a group of high school boys in varsity jackets stormed in, loud from a football win, and louder still from youth and ego. They claimed the largest booth, their laughter overpowering the soft jazz on the speakers. One of them, Jason Reynolds, slouched arrogantly at the head of the table, scanning the room like he owned. His eyes landed on Franklin. "Hey," Jason said with a crooked smirk, elbowing his friends. "Check out the old guy in the corner. Look at his hands, bet he spills half his soup before it hits his mouth." Laughter erupted from the booth. Franklin heard. Of course he did, but he didn't flinch. He carefully set down his mug and unfolded a napkin on his lap. His eyes, calm but distant, stayed fixed on his plate. Jason wasn't finished. "Hey, old man," he called louder. "Did you even have guns in your war, or did you just throw rocks at the enemy?" The diner fell into a sudden hush. Doris, the longtime waitress behind the counter, turned sharply, mouth open in disbelief. Other patrons glanced up, unsure whether to intervene. Still, Franklin didn't rise to the bait. But the universe has its own sense of timing. The door opened once more, and a man in his early 70s stepped inside, brushing rain from his coat. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a quiet authority that followed him like a shadow. His eyes swept the diner past the stunned silence, past the grinning teenagers, and locked onto the corner booth. His expression shifted. Because Robert Reynolds had just walked in, and he had recognized the man his grandson had just mocked, Captain Franklin Hayes, the Marine, who had once carried him through hell and saved his life. What happened next would change all three of their lives. Robert Reynolds stood just inside the doorway, rain still dripping from his coat sleeves, his eyes locked on the corner booth. "Captain Hayes," he said, softly, disbelief and recognition crossing his face all at once. Franklin Hayes looked up slowly. His eyes squinted for just a moment, studying the man's face. Then the years fell away. "Sergeant Reynolds," Franklin said, his voice steady, etched with quiet surprise. "It's been a long time." Jason froze. His head snapped between his grandfather and the man he had just mocked. He looked at Franklin again, this time not as a target for his jokes, but as someone his grandfather, the man he respected most, was now addressing with military reverence. Robert squared his shoulders, the years of civilian life falling away like old dust. He crossed the diner in 3 brisk steps, and in front of the whole room stood at attention. "Captain Franklin Hayes, sir, Fox Company, Chosen Reservoir, reporting as ordered." A wave of murmurs swept the diner. The teenagers fell silent, the joking drained from their faces. Doris behind the counter stopped mid-pour the coffee in her pot, forgotten. Everyone in that room could feel it. Something important had just unfolded before them, and none dared interrupt. Franklin stood with effort, leaning slightly on the table for support. "At ease, Sergeant," he said with a faint smile. "You made it." Robert stepped forward and shook his hand firmly, reverently. "You saved my life. I never forgot." Jason's voice, tentative now, broke the silence. "Grandpa, you know him?" Robert turned slowly toward his grandson, his jaw tight. "Know him?" he echoed, voice sharp and low. "Jason, you didn't just insult an old man. You mocked a war hero, a man who carried me 3 miles on his back through enemy fire when I was shot and couldn't walk. When the order came to leave the wounded behind, Captain Hayes refused. He disobeyed the order. He carried me to safety while still commanding his men." Jason took a step back, his face pale. I didn't know." "That's right," Robert snapped. "You didn't know because you didn't care to know. You saw someone who looked weak and you decided he was worthless." The sting in Robert's voice hit harder than any physical blow. The entire diner was now silent, the jazz from the jukebox reduced to a ghost of sound in the background. Franklin watched the exchange quietly, his face unreadable. Then he said gently, "He's just a boy, Robert." "No," Robert said, turning back to Franklin, his voice cracking. "He's my grandson, and I've failed him. I thought I'd taught him respect. Clearly I haven't." Jason stood there, shoulders hunched, his usual swagger gone. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, eyes downcast. "Look at him when you apologize," Robert said firmly. Jason looked up, eyes meeting Franklin's. "I'm sorry, sir. What I said was wrong. It was disrespectful. I didn't know who you were, but that doesn't excuse it." Franklin studied him for a moment. Then he slowly nodded. "Apology accepted, son. It takes more strength to admit when you're wrong than it does to pretend you're always right." Doris approached, then a fresh coffee pot in her hand. "Captain Hayes' coffee's on the house today," she said softly. "For you and your guests." Franklin gave her a nod. "Thank you, Doris." Robert gestured toward the booth. "Sir, would you allow us to sit with you? I believe Jason still has something to learn." Franklin hesitated only briefly, then motioned to the empty seats across from him. "Of course." They sat. Jason slid into the booth, last clearly uncomfortable but trying. For a long moment, silence hovered between them. Then Robert began to speak, not about battles but about character, about how Franklin wasn't just a brave Marine but a compassionate leader, about how in the worst days of Korea days, where the snow turned red and hope was measured in inches, Franklin Hayes had kept them together. Not through speeches or orders, but through actions, through quiet courage and the willingness to shoulder another man's burden when he could barely carry his own. Jason listened, shame slowly transforming into understanding. He looked at Franklin not as a frail old man, but as someone whose trembling hands had once held the lives of men in them. "You led them through that?" he asked finally. "I did what needed to be done," Franklin replied simply. "Any man in my position would have done the same." "No," Robert said, "they wouldn't have, but you did." Jason leaned forward. "Why didn't you ever tell me about this, Grandpa?" Robert smiled faintly. "Some stories are too big for words, son. And some men, like Captain Hayes, deserve to be remembered not for what they said, but for what they did." Franklin turned to Jason. "Your grandfather's right. Respect isn't about medals or titles. It's about how you carry yourself, about what you do when no one's watching." Jason nodded slowly, beginning to grasp the lesson that no classroom, no textbook, and no game had ever taught him. Outside, the wind had died down. Inside, something had changed, something quiet but profound. A bridge had been built between generations. And for Jason Reynolds, the journey toward manhood had just begun. The Veterans Day ceremony was just 2 days away when the call came. Robert answered the phone with a frown, listening silently before muttering, "We're on our way." Jason, seated across the living room, stood the moment he saw his grandfather's face darken. "It's Franklin," Robert said, already grabbing his coat. He fell. Dizzy spell, possibly a stroke. They drove in silence, tension stretching the air tight between them. When they arrived at Franklin Hayes' small bungalow, paramedics were already inside. Franklin lay beside his bed, still dressed in full Marine dress blues, medals aligned perfectly across his chest. His skin was pale, but his eyes were alert. "Fell trying to get dressed," Franklin muttered weakly. "Didn't want." Robert knelt beside him. "You need to go to the hospital." Franklin's trembling hand gripped Jason's wrist. "Promise me something, son. The roll call, the names. They need to be read." Jason nodded, kneeling lower. "I'll read them, I promise." "In my jacket," Franklin whispered, his voice cracking. "Left inside pocket. Paper's old, don't lose it." Jason reached in carefully and pulled out a worn, yellowed piece of paper folded neatly. He unfolded it, revealing 27 handwritten names, each one followed by a hometown and age. Many were only 18 or 19. "I've got them," he said. As the paramedics lifted Franklin onto the stretcher, he locked eyes with Jason again. "Don't forget the pause after each name. And the bell. They earned that." Jason swallowed hard. "I'll do it right, sir." By the time the ceremony began at Memorial Park, word had spread that Captain Hayes was in the hospital. The crowd was larger than usual, veterans in full dress, families with children, local officials, and civilians bundled in scarves and coats beneath a bright November sky. Jason stood behind the main podium, the paper clutched tightly in his hand. He wore no uniform, only a navy blazer and khakis, but his posture carried a new weight. Confidence had replaced arrogance, reverence in place of mockery. The mayor finished her remarks, then turned to the crowd. Each year, Captain Franklin Hayes has read the names of the 27 men from Fox Company who gave their lives at Chosin Reservoir. Today, Captain Hayes is unable to be here, but someone will carry his voice forward. She nodded toward Jason. Jason stepped to the microphone, heart pounding. "My name is Jason Reynolds," he began. "My grandfather, Sergeant Robert Reynolds, served under Captain Hayes. I met the captain just days ago. I made a mistake. Then, a mistake I deeply regret. Today I stand here to honor the men I once knew nothing about, and now I will never forget them." He unfolded the paper, took a breath. Private First Class Michael Abernathy, Tulsa, Oklahoma. A bell tolled, once clear and solemn. Private James Buchanan, Savannah, Georgia. Another bell. The crowd was silent, unmoving. With each name, Jason's voice grew steadier. He wasn't just reading words. He was carrying legacies. 25 names echoed across the park, each followed by the bell, each ringing like a heartbeat in the cool autumn air. When he reached the final two names, something caught his eye. Movement at the edge of the crowd. An ambulance had arrived quietly. Paramedics helped an elderly man out, dressed in marine blues medals gleaming faintly in the light, an IV still taped to his arm. Jason froze, recognizing him instantly. Franklin Hayes had come. Beside him stood Robert, one hand on Franklin's shoulder. Neither said a word. They didn't need to. Jason turned back to the microphone. "Corporal James Zimmerman, Portland, Maine." Bell toll. He stared at the final name written in a shake your hand. Unlike the others, this one had a date just 5 years ago. Staff Sergeant Richard Hayes, Boston, Massachusetts. Jason's voice cracked. The bell rang for the 27th time. He looked up. Franklin was now at the front of the crowd, seated in his wheelchair, back straight. His trembling right hand slowly rose in a salute. Jason stood tall and called out the final word. "Present in spirit, sir." Silence followed, deep and reverent. Then as one, every veteran in attendance raised their hand in salute. Jason stepped back from the podium, emotion choking him. The list in his hand no longer felt like paper. It felt like weight, like memory. As he made his way through the crowd, people stepped aside for him. Some patted his shoulder. Others simply nodded. When he reached Franklin and Robert, he tried to speak, but Franklin beat him to it. "You did well, son," Franklin said, voice raspy. "They would be proud." And for the first time, Jason believed it. Jason visited the hospital the next morning, just as Franklin Hayes had asked. The sterile white walls and soft beeping of machines were a far cry from the crisp solemnity of the Veterans Day ceremony, but Franklin greeted him with the same calm dignity. "You showed up," Franklin said with a small smile. "That means something." Jason pulled up a chair beside the bed. "I said I would." The first visit was quiet. Jason mostly listened. Franklin's voice was slower now. His body weakened by the stroke, but his memory remained razor sharp. He didn't speak of medals or battlefield glory. He told stories of the men. Michael Abernathy, Franklin said, eyes drifting toward the ceiling, drew these hilarious caricatures of everyone in the unit, even sketched me once with donkey ears. I kept that drawing in my footlocker. Jason chuckled softly. James Buchanan, Franklin continued. Wanted to open a Southern-style diner. Said he was going to name it after his mom, Ruby's kitchen. With each name, each memory, Jason saw the names from the list transform into people. They weren't just casualties in a war he hadn't lived through. They were young men with dreams and quirks and futures stolen by frost and fire. He returned the next day and the next. Sometimes Robert came too, but often it was just the two of them, teenager and old Marine one, soaking in history, not from textbooks, but from someone who had lived it and carried it quietly for 70 years. One afternoon, Jason asked, "Do you ever regret it, serving?" Franklin looked at him for a long moment before replying, "No, but I regret the things I never said to the families of the boys who didn't come home. That's why the names matter. Saying them out loud, it keeps them here," it reminded. At school, Jason found himself changed. His friends noticed. He wasn't as quick to join in the jokes. He was quieter, more thoughtful. When asked where he'd been over the weekend, he told them about Franklin, about the roll call, about what it meant to read those names. Some scoffed. One shrugged, but another leaned in and said, "My uncle was in Afghanistan. He doesn't talk about it. I never thought to ask." That was the moment Jason had an idea. By the end of the week, he drafted a proposal and brought it to his principal, a student-led club connecting high schoolers with local veterans. The idea was simple: meet regularly, share stories, learn from each other. He called it Bridging the Silence. The name came from something Franklin had once said: "The silence after war is often the heaviest thing a man carries." To his surprise, the school approved it. Posters went up. The first meeting was held in the library after hours. Only 5 students showed up, but 2 veterans came. One was a Navy medic who served in Vietnam. The other had flown helicopters in Iraq. They shared stories, some funny, some raw, all real. Jason noticed the way the room changed as they spoke. Jokes faded. Eyes stayed locked in. Phones stayed down. When Jason visited Franklin the next day, he told him everything. Franklin grinned. That club, that's the kind of leadership we need, not just on battlefields, but in everyday life. Each week, the group grew. Word spread. Veterans who had never spoken publicly before came forward. Students who had never cared about history stayed after school to listen. Jason was still a teenager. He still played football. He still goofed off in the lunchroom. But something in him had shifted, something permanent. He began seeing service not as something distant or glorified, but as a responsibility, a chance to carry the stories of others when they could no longer carry them themselves. One evening, as he sat beside Franklin during another hospital visit, he asked, "Did you ever think a dumb joke in a diner could lead to this?" Franklin chuckled, the sound gravelly but warm. "No, son, but sometimes the sharpest lessons come from the most foolish moments. What matters is what you do after." Jason leaned back in his chair. "You think I'm doing okay?" Franklin turned to him, his eyes sharp despite the lines around them. "Jason, you're not just doing okay. You're becoming the kind of man this country needs more of." Jason looked down, humbled. "I'm just trying to make up for what I said." "No," Franklin said, "you're doing more than that. You're making it matter." By early spring, Franklin Hayes was strong enough to return to Rosie's diner. His tremor remained and he still walked with a cane, but his mind was sharp and his routine was unchanged. Tuesdays at 1 p.m., corner booth, black coffee, and a turkey sandwich with extra pickles. The only difference now was that he wasn't alone. Jason Reynolds sat across from him every week, no longer just a teenager who had once mocked a veteran, but a young man transformed by their friendship. They spoke less about war and more about life decisions, doubts, and the future. Jason shared his acceptance letter to college and his decision to pursue a Marine Corps ROTC scholarship. Franklin had only nodded at first, then extended his hand across the table. "You won't be following in my footsteps," he said. "You'll be making your own. That's what service is." By June, the high school graduation gymnasium buzzed with celebration. Families filled the bleachers, balloons swayed, and cameras flashed. Franklin sat between Robert Reynolds and Jason's mother, dressed sharply in his Marine Corps cap and blazer, his medals catching the light. When Jason received his diploma, he walked past the cheering crowd and approached the row where Franklin sat. Without hesitation, Jason halted before him, heels together, and rendered a sharp practice salute. Franklin slowly rose despite the ache in his knees and returned the salute with a hand that trembled not from weakness, but from emotion. "Thank you, sir," Jason said softly, "for teaching me that true respect isn't about age. It's about recognizing the quiet strength of sacrifice, the courage of service, and the dignity of a life lived for others." Franklin's eyes misted, but his voice held steady. "You're ready, and they'd all be proud of you." Later that evening, Jason sat alone, the ceremony behind him, the future ahead. He pulled the folded list of 27 names from his wallet, a promise still kept. He knew he'd carry their legacy into every step of his journey. Sometimes the most important lessons don't come from classrooms or books. They come from people we overlook. Franklin Hayes didn't just serve his country, he transformed a life through quiet strength and living history. In a world quick to forget, one young man chose to remember, and in doing so, he found his purpose. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below. What's one thing you've learned from it? And don't forget to subscribe for more real, powerful, and emotional stories that remind us what truly matters.